Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Lissy Chiquette. I'm the Executive Director at Words Without Borders, and it is a very special honor to introduce tonight's Ottaway ceremony honoring Christopher Merrill. The Words Without Borders Board established this award in 2013 as a way to recognize individuals who have dedicated their careers to championing literature from around the world, bringing brilliant and necessary writing to readers in English and, through English, into a much wider literary conversation. The award bears the name of Words Without Borders' first chair, Jim Ottaway Jr., who unfortunately can't be with us here tonight, but who, in his thoughtful, strategic, and behind-the-scenes way, has given Words Without Borders the foundation to grow into the organization that it is today. The Ottaway Award for Promotion of International Literature was awarded for the first time in 2013 to editor Drenko Willen, who published so many Nobel laureates that I am told people would joke that she should keep a pied-à-terre in Stockholm. In addition to Willen, Ottaway laureates to date include the late Carol Brenner Janeway and Edie Grossman, as well as Sarah Burstall, Jill Schoolman, Barbara Epler, Chad Post, who joins us tonight, Levine Bishore, Danny Hahn, and Ashland Bailey. Honestly, this list includes many of my literary heroes, and I suspect it includes your heroes too. Editors, writers, translators who, with their great vision and creativity and generosity, have not only championed writing from around the world, but shaped the very landscape of international literature and built a more connected world. This is what we're here to celebrate tonight as we honor Christopher Merrill's extraordinary work. Chris is a true advocate of international literature who has advanced its reach in the Anglophone world through cultural diplomacy and by uplifting international writers. In addition to being an award-winning poet, writer, and editor, Chris has served as the director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa for the past 25 years. IWP is a cornerstone of global literary exchange, awarding Iowa City residencies to talented writers from around the world, who are also in the room, bringing international literature into classrooms and introducing American authors to other cultures. Since joining as director in the year 2000, Chris has significantly expanded the program by increasing the number of countries that send writers to IWP, facilitating the translation of international writers, and by personally leading workshops and reading tours abroad. Chris has conducted cultural diplomacy missions to more than 50 countries and served on the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and on the National Council on the Humanities. And Chris also led the initiative that resulted in Iowa City being named a UNESCO City of Literature in 2008. At the time, it was only the third UNESCO City of Literature anywhere in the world and the very first in North America. Of course, we cannot ignore the fact that we are gathering tonight in celebration under the shadow of immense threats to arts and culture in the United States. IWP was one of the very first State Department programs terminated by the Trump administration. And here at Words Without Borders, we've already felt the impact of DOGE cuts with the termination of our NE grant and the dissolution of the incredible staff at the National Endowment for the Arts. Such actions are chilling not only for IWP and Words Without Borders, but for the literary arts as a whole, and for everybody who believes in the power of literature. While the current administration may say otherwise, we know that readers across the country and around the world still deserve access to dazzling global literature. We know that free artistic expression and a well-funded arts landscape are foundations of a just and thriving society. And we know that a world that embodies these values is possible, because at its core, that is the promise of literature. It allows us to imagine how else the world might be. So now I would like to introduce Alane Salierno Mason, who will be presenting tonight's laudation by Tom Sleigh. Tom Sleigh, author of the 2023 Patterson Poetry Prize winner, The King's Touch, is an award-winning poet, journalist, and essayist. His most recent book of essays is The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in an Age of Refugees. And during the last decade, he has also worked as a journalist in Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Kenya, Iraq, and Libya. A distinguished professor at Hunter College, he lives in Brooklyn, New York, though he is currently in Ireland, which is why Alane has generously agreed to read Tom's laudation. Thank you, Alane. Alane Salierno Mason is founder and president of Words Without Borders, as well as the vice president and executive editor at WW Norton, where over the past 30 years, she has acquired and edited over 300 books of fiction and nonfiction. In 2014, she was awarded the first ever Editorial Achievement Award from the Asian American Writers Workshop for broadening the world of American letters to include global and diasporic narratives. Please join me in welcoming Alane.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I have to say, it is a particular pleasure to that we are awarding the Ottaway this year to Christopher Merrill, because Chris is one of actually quite a few people in this room who got an out of the blue email from me in 2001 describing the seed of an idea for an online hub. I think in those days we even called it a portal for international literature and translation. And Chris replied to my email, was totally generous. I mean, instantly replied, was totally generous, agreed to be on a board of consulting editors, even offered some sample translations of new work by Thomas Salomon and Alice Delgaviak, the Slovenian poets, to include in our NEA application. And along with Linda Asher and Esther Allen, and I think Margot Viscusi, and no doubt somebody else in this room that I'm forgetting, was really one of the first supporters of the project at a time when the support was absolutely invaluable. I mean, there's no way that I would have continued pursuing this if it hadn't been for people whom I respected so enormously, who said, yeah, it's actually a good idea. You should do it. So thank you, Chris. And isn't it amazing that since then, Words Without Borders has now published over 3,000 pieces, 3,300 pieces from 147 languages. No, sorry, 141 languages and 147 countries. Words Without Borders has over 500,000 site visits annually. About 40% are based in the US, with about 60% from the rest of the world. We've had at least 5 or so writers in the past few years whose work has been discovered on Words Without Borders, have publishers come to them and translate editions of a complete book. We published Elena Ferrante before she was known as Elena Ferrante, plus I think 7 Nobel Prize winners before they won the Nobel Prize. And our campus project, Reaching Students, has now reached at least 50,000 educators and students since its founding in 2017. I mean, it really almost brings tears to my eyes. I'm so proud at what's happened with this project. And as I say, would never have happened without you, Chris and others. So really nothing could give me more satisfaction than to see this award going this year. Now for Tom Sleigh's remarks, which I didn't know all this stuff about you until I read this. I haven't had the time to respond to my email. I really don't know. But this is a tribute to Christopher Merrill from Tom Sleigh. It's difficult to know how to praise a writer who has already been knighted by the French government, whose work has been translated into 40 languages, who has published 7 books of poems and 6 books of nonfiction, and has edited or translated some 20 or so additional volumes. I think there are also 5 plays that he didn't mention here. His list of awards from here and abroad are as long as both my arms. Awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, the Slovenian Ministry of Culture, a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize, the Bosnia Herzegovina Annual Literary Award, the Bosnian Stek Cup, the Costa Kriziazis International Literary Prize, and so on and so forth. And I'm sorry that I failed the initial test of speech giving, which is that you check all the pronunciations. On top of this, as a journalist, he covered the war in the Balkans, where he was pinned down behind a tree by a sniper, among many other close calls. He served as a coach for a college soccer team, as well as being a star midfielder in college himself, which will really impress my sons. And of course, he's written a book about soccer. He worked in a plant nursery, which forms part of his mordant, tough-minded, and elegiac memoir. Its originality and selflessness defy the usual conventions of the form by putting other people and his relationships with them at the center of self-portrait with dogwood. And when he's not writing or being knighted or thinking about dogwood trees, he directs the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Each year, he brings 30 or so well-known writers from all over the globe to reside for a semester at the university in order to write, meet each other, and engage in cultural exchange, which means hanging out and reading each other's work and talking and joking and seeing each other not only as writers, but in Yeats's phrase, that bundle of accident and incoherence that sits down to breakfast. When, you might ask, does he sleep? And the answer would be on airplanes. Because in addition to all this, he also shepherds American writers to cross-cultural exchanges in over 50 countries, which works out to more than a quarter of the countries in the entire world. I mention this to give you a clear sense of Merrill's many talents. This may sound extreme, but there is no one in the world today who has done more than Chris to create what Seamus Heaney once said was Osip Mandelstamm's goal, to make the steadfastness of speech articulation a global spiritual endeavor that involves all humankind. In Merrill's view, literature is its own independent category of consciousness, and it presents a counter-reality that is equal to, but also surpasses, the conditions that give rise to it. Given the breadth of his passions and engagements, is it any wonder then that I met Merrill, who is already something of a legendary figure to me, not in the US, but in Lebanon and Syria? And then I had the great good fortune to travel with him in East Africa, to Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, and then to travel with him to Iraq, a country he's visited many times. In fact, he was instrumental in aiding Iraqi writers to get Baghdad named in 2015 a UNESCO City of Literature. And when he's not overseas, he's here at home, helping to foster the literary arts by serving on the National Council on the Humanities, to which he was appointed by President Obama. Of a piece with his advocacy of literature worldwide is his own work. In his book of prose poems, After the Fact, Scripts and Postscripts, that he wrote as a dialogue with the poet Marvin Bell, you're privileged to witness an elusive, shrewd, brilliantly analytical intelligence, one passionately committed to world humanism, but also profoundly skeptical of it, especially given the atrocities and blood that he's reported on and witnessed firsthand. These are some of the most original poems that I've read in a very long time. They have a slightly fabulous cast, a Kafkaesque sense that inside everyone an inner cockroach is waiting to come out. An eerie but deeply human recognition in which, yes, even the cockroach has an inner life and feelings and deserves to be thought about in language that is precise in its descriptive powers and moves easily and swiftly from imagistic to cultural to political to spiritual associations. His ability to construct a compressed narrative in which the history of Colonel Gaddafi's Libya is refracted through the life of a single Libyan poet who was on Gaddafi's kill list, at least until Gaddafi himself was killed, brings into stark relief the historical ironies and potentialities of not only one man, but his entire country. In poem after poem, Merrill shows what it means not to bear witness to history, whatever that lofty sounding phrase means, but to write from the ground up just how a bullet casing looks, or how his Libyan friend insists that Gaddafi's son be treated humanely, at least until he's hanged, and how there's a list of other things beyond the kill list that the reprieved Libyan poet has to show his poet visitor. No one in America writes with more authority and from a more deeply inside what it actually means to reside in a global community, a community that has almost nothing to do with hectoring large-scale, all-caps ideas like freedom, jihad, the global marketplace, MAGA. and everything to do with moments of such irony and affection and humor and horror, all mixed up together, that any attempt to reduce his sense of the world to an orotund summation would be a violation of his work's complexity. Back in January, Chris and I traveled to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, places where Chris, of course, has been before. As part of our travels, we went to a small mountain city called Taif and visited, among other places, a rosewater factory. We were welcomed by an older gentleman who sang to us a traditional Bedouin greeting while showering us with handfuls of rose petals. There was something more than a little hallucinatory about it, as if time had skewed into another century, either deep into the past or far into the future. The rose petals landed on our shoulders and in our hair before fluttering to the concrete factory floor, which took on the look of a rose garden, utility turning to wonder even as the petals grazing our skin had a faintly ammoniac smell, as of something fresh on the verge of turning rotten. Chris and I have traveled together many times, and there's always a moment like this one, a moment of such unlikelihood that for all the strange things Chris has seen, he's never seen anything quite like this. That's when he shifts from being the consummate cultural diplomat to the acute observer of his poetry and prose. And because he's seen more of the world than anyone I've ever known, he achieves what Czesław Miłosz once called the general human perspective, in which the narrow affiliations of blood and country fall away precisely because the details of his impressions are so beautifully embodied on the page. He's like a latter-day Herodotus, interested in everything, dismissive of nothing, always ready to credit marvels, but wary, hard-headed, and self-skeptical. All qualities that as a writer and a person I've tried to emulate as best I can. But back in the spring of 2007, when we first met, not as I mentioned earlier in the US, but in Lebanon, I knew little of such habits of attention, at least as they applied to journalism. In Beirut, a mini civil war had broken out, car bombs and assassinations crescendoing to a full-scale siege by the Lebanese army of a refugee camp, in which Chris came close to being shot by an overzealous Lebanese army officer. But forget the big boffo, I've stared into the eyes of death and never blinked stuff. I noticed that he was taking notes even when nothing of much interest, at least in my unobservant eyes, seemed to be going on. I'd been asked to write something about the trip, and although I had a pen and notebook, it was my first time as a journalist, and I had no idea what I was supposed to be writing down. So when I asked Chris what I should be doing, he shrugged. Tom, nobody's interested in your feelings. Instead, just jot down a few details of whatever's actually going on so that you can recall it in detail when you're back home. Not punditry, not opinion mongering, just, in Seamus Heaney's phrase, the music of what happens. A music that can't be faked, at least if you're interested in a rose the way Chris is, not for its symbolic rosiness, but for the slippery, slightly nauseating smell of rose petals smash underfoot. All of which is to say that Chris's vision is unique in American letters. One of his great triumphs as a writer is that he's refused to allow his work to be balkanized by politics, history, and atrocity, while it nonetheless partakes of them. He possesses what the Polish poet, oh no, I can't pronounce his name, Zbigniew Herbert possessed, a sense of personal and historical irony so fine that no abstraction can violate it. His work embodies what the Chinese ideogram for integrity is supposed to pictorially represent: the figure of a man standing next to a mouth. That is, a man literally standing by his word. Thank you to Tom Sleigh for that beautiful encomium. And I think Margot Viscusi somebody else who responded to an email in 2001 and has served long and devotedly on the board of Words Without Borders, is going to present the Ottaway Award to Christopher Merrill.
What a speech, my God. I think I owe Tom some more money than that. The thing is, when Tom was asking me how you go about reporting on something, I said pretty much what he said there. But he really took it to heart and has become an extraordinary essayist and documentarian of those the very music of what happens that you described. I wish to thank my friend Tom Sleigh, who is not only a terrific poet and essayist, but the best possible travel companion to have, especially to places that are, shall we say, less than safe. I should tell you, at one point, he called me up and he said, "What do you think about going to a place that has Ebola?" I said, "Well, yeah, you could do that, but maybe not a great idea." Thank you to Alane and Dee Feldman and Samantha Schnee, the founders of Words Without Borders, which is an indispensable source of international literature, as well as Lisa Jaquette, Nina Parata, Zapora Price, my old friend Susan Harris, and Jim Ottaway Jr., for whom this award is named. I confess that when Lissy informed me that I was the 2025 recipient of this, the recipient of this award, I deemed it a sort of consolation prize for what a retired diplomat friend refers to as, quote, "the perverse honor I have of directing one of the first State Department programs terminated by the Trump administration, which effectively dissolved a partnership with the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs dating back to the 1960s. Cultural diplomacy, the exchange of information and ideas, is what I have practiced for the last 25 years at the helm of the International Writing Program, or IWP. And it is strange for me to no longer be in daily contact with our program officer in Washington, who is also a cherished friend. But gratitude is what I feel tonight for Words Without Borders, Mr. Ottaway, my staff, civil service in Washington, Forest Service officers, and local staff at U.S. embassies and consulates, all the poets and writers who have graced the IWP with their presence now. So from here tonight, thank you, friends. And all they have left behind on the page and in memory. Perhaps it will be useful in my remarks tonight to give you a sense of what we lose when we turn our backs on the world, trading soft or smart power initiatives for the greed and bluster of a tyrant. The news of our termination arrived on the same day that Elon Musk and his Doge henchmen canceled 5,200 USAID contracts and fired or placed on administrative leave most of that agency's employees, dismantling a relatively inexpensive means of combating global health challenges, from dispensing HIV/AIDS medications and mosquito nets to providing support to communities affected by natural disasters. These cuts to spending on American humanitarian programs, which will likely cause the deaths of millions of children over the next 5 years, and which have already cost the lives of 300,000 children, according to a recent estimate, prompted Bill Gates to remark that, quote, "the world's richest man has been involved in the deaths of the world's poorest children." Who knew that America First could be so lethal? Musk has left the capital, but the damage remains. The gifts of time and space and camaraderie the IWP has offered to more than 1,600 distinguished poets and writers from 160 countries, including 3 future Nobel laureates, are as nothing compared to the life-saving measures and support for democratic processes, sustainable economic development, and protection of the environment that USAID has provided to communities around the world. But the connections forged by the IWP between writers, translators, editors, literary agents, and readers has made a difference in the lives of countless individuals. Only connect, E.M. Forster's advice for young novelists, has been my mantra during my tenure at the IWP, which began with rebuilding a storied institution that had fallen apart in the aftermath of the Cold War, included leading the charge for Iowa City to become the third UNESCO City of Literature in 2008, and produced a number of vital literary projects and programs, all of which ended on February 26th, when the State Department terminated grants totaling nearly $1 million. It fell to me to inform our program officer about our stop work order. She was at a doctor's appointment, promised to check her email when she got home, and professed never to learn why the IWP had been singled out beyond the assertion that our program no longer aligned with, quote, the national interest. What the national interest may be, of course, is always subject to debate, an essential element of democracy. Perhaps not since the run-up to the Civil War, as that debate seemed quite as sharp as it has in the months following the inauguration of Donald Trump, whose attacks on immigrants at NATO, Ukraine, the European Union, the media, judges, law firms, universities, international students, the Department of Education, the Library of Congress, the EPA, NSF, NIH, NEA, NEH, Bruce Springsteen, and Taylor Swift have damaged, if not destroyed, what were long considered to be democratic norms, in short, the national interest. It is difficult for me to believe that creating a forum for writers from different countries to exchange ideas, works, and impression does not contribute to a dialogue central to democracy. Indeed, from the IWP's origin in 1967, we have prided ourselves on our ability to respond to changing political circumstances in global affairs, from the Cold War to the establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, to 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to COVID-19, we found ways to foster the production of international literature until January, when Trump's landing team arrived at the State Department to manage the transition to the new regime with members of DOGE in tow. Soon our program officer was asking us to supply language with which to justify our existence to the landing team. How did the IWP make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? Plainly, our answers, offering writers time and space to write in our UNESCO City of Literature, to garner more nuanced impressions of this country, and to gain a network of new friends while introducing American audiences to a wealth of different ways of apprehending the world, did not impress the incoming leadership. Scores of alumni have told us that the IWP played a formative role in their artistic development, praise that seemingly fell on deaf ears at the State Department. Thus, a fact sheet we produced highlighting the Nobel laureates we have hosted prompted one official to ask why there were no Americans on the list. I replied that the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is just across the street from the IWP, has trained enough prize-winning writers for Iowa City to be called Pulitzer Town. This too did not alter what in retrospect was probably always a lost cause. During orientation in the fall residency, I usually note that Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America belongs to a tradition of foreign writers turning their observations about their sojourns in our country into vibrant works of literature. And when the residency coincides with a presidential election, I find that our writers pay close attention to the polls, sometimes choosing to document what they see and hear in the heartland. University of Iowa librarians have collected more than 20,000 volumes of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and plays published by IWP alumni, which provide vivid evidence of the literary delights on offer from our engagement with writers from, well, everywhere. We find a language for what they experienced during their time in Iowa, and some of it tells us a lot about who and what we are. Why would we not want to hear more? And I sometimes joke when I give speeches in Iowa that also what happens in the fall residency is the writers, they come, they write, they meet other writers, they fall in love, they fall out of love, they write books about it. I said, so I tell Iowans, so it is possible that around the world, people have a slightly racier view of Iowa than most Americans do. For example, the jazz vibraphonist Stefan Harris once brought his quartet to the university for a week-long residency, which included 2 workshops and a cabaret-style performance with a dozen poets from the IWP. Stefan's idea was to listen to the poets read in their native languages, then use the sounds, the syllables and rhythms, as a springboard for improvisation. He had read English translations of the poems ahead of time, but he was more interested in linguistic textures than meaning, in the process more than the product. The first poet to offer his work to the musicians, a Lithuanian with a jazz degree from the conservatory in Vilnius, instructed Stefan to play take 5. Stefan, raising an eyebrow, nodded to his pianist, who half-heartedly took up the tune. The bassist, drummer joined in. Stefan tapped out a line or two. At the conclusion of the piece, he said, "That was fine, but that's not really how we like to play. What we do," here he smiled at the musicians, "is listen for a door to a space we can enter. If we don't find anything interesting there, we'll listen for another door. So why don't we play that again? Try that again with you reading your poem. We'll listen." The Lithuanian seemed miffed, but nevertheless, he read his poem, at the end of which Stefan turned to the pianist. "I think I hear F sharp minor to D minor. Do you hear that?" The pianist shrugged. "Let's try it," said Stefan. And then they were off, playing with the sort of joy that is born of an artist's decision to surrender to the materials at hand. In fact, the musicians found something to inspire them in every poem. Stefan made notes on their discoveries, the most interesting of which came last, when he asked a poet from Botswana to translate a chant he had written in English into Setswana, his native language. The poet obliged. Stefan and the pianist smiled, and what they discovered in their riffs was no less exciting, both in this workshop and in the performance the next night, an hour-long exchange of musical and literary ideas, some of which made it into Stefan's concert on the last night of their residency. Indeed, I was surprised to hear in their final performance several riffs from our workshop, and the journalist in me wondered if the musicians had recycled some old ideas for the poets. The bassist adamantly denied this at the party afterwards, insisting that these riffs were new additions to their musical vocabulary. "Permanent," I said. "No," he said, "just till we get bored with them." But Stefan had the final word. When I asked him the same question, he said the riffs were now a permanent part of his vocabulary. I'd like to think that once you set a tune in motion, it works on all of us. One year we had in residence 3 Chinese writers from 3 generations, a poet, a fiction writer, and a playwright, who met every day to discuss the literary and political situation in their homeland. There is no way to gauge how their conversations will shape China's future, but I was certain that in their determination to find common ground, they created a force for good. In this, I am reminded of Winston Churchill's observation about the usefulness of conferences, that it is better to jaw than to war. For this is how we connect, as we learn in some lines from a poem by Jory Graham, who was a student and then a teacher in the writer's workshop. The way things work is that eventually something catches. The beauty of an exchange program like the IWP is that sometimes things catch, connections are made, and the rest is literature. As it happens, I had just returned from the fourth dialogue on exchanges and mutual learning among civilizations in the ancient Silk Road oasis of Dunhuang, China, where 300 delegates from 60 countries, including writers, sinologists, lawyers, political figures, and representatives of NGOs, gathered to trade ideas about cultural exchange and connect. Diversity, that bugaboo of the Trump administration, was in one language or another on everybody's tongue. Also, tariff and Trump's promise to revoke the visas of 275,000 Chinese students in America. It was, as you might imagine, disconcerting for me to be invited to speak about some of the Chinese writers I have hosted in Iowa City, including Mo Yan, Su Tang, Yu Hua, Li Rei, and Shi Chuan, knowing that my staff and I must reimagine what part the IWP, stripped of its federal support and cultural diplomatic role, will play in the literary ecosystem. We must reinvent ourselves, so to say, which is what writers are always obliged to do, you know? In Dunhuang, I had the good luck to spend an afternoon visiting the Mogao Caves, also known as the Thousand Buddha Caves, a UNESCO World Heritage Site comprised of grottos carved into the cliffs above the Dashuan River in Gansu province, and decorated with the most extraordinary Buddhist wall paintings and sculptures, some dating back to 366 AD. Here was a place of worship central to the Tang Dynasty, where I found myself recalling my introduction as an undergraduate to Ezra Pound's Cathay, how his translations of classical Chinese poetry shaped the development of modernist poetics, which in turn inspired some of my own poems. And now I thought about the library cave, a treasure trove of some 50,000 scrolls and manuscripts of literature, philosophy, art, and medicine, composed in Chinese, Tibetan, Uyghur, Sanskrit, Hebrew, and other languages. How it was inexplicably sealed off in the 11th century and forgotten until 1900, when a Taoist priest discovered it, thereby saving some portion of the literary inheritance that no one knew anything about. This is, if you like, a study in connections made, missed, and perhaps reestablished. By itself, Wrong spreads nearly 5 pages in the OED. William Matthews observes in A Happy Childhood's concluding suite of poems, and meant in its ancestral forms, curved, bent, the rib of a ship, neither straight nor true, but apt for its work. His meditation on what it means to be in the wrong ends with a question that has haunted me in these troubling times. The detection of wrong and the study of error are lonely chores, though who is wrong by himself and who is by himself accepting error? Pariah states do not emerge by accident, but by one error after another, the sum total of which leaves their citizens isolated from the rest of the world. And since it may be impossible to enumerate all the wrongs the Trump administration has inflicted on our body politic, denizens of the Republic of Letters know we have our work cut out for us. Thank you very much.